to me. And I told Mom I loved her a long time ago, and she loved us kids too, and she was really special and important to us. She grew up in Brown County, which is a neighboring county to Bartholomew, on a little farm, and Grandpa lived off of the earth. He dug ginseng roots and sold them in Cincinnati, sold sassafras roots, and they literally lived on the farm. They had a cow, a well that they dumped a bucket down into and pulled the water out, and they literally lived off of the land. And he told me a story one time about his bull. He had a bull that hated women.
That hated women, huh?
If it wore a skirt and had a sunbonnet on, which all women, I think, wore at that time, Grandma did, and he chased her out of the yard or the pen one day, and almost got her, and it really upset Grandpa. So he put on a sunbonnet and one of Grandma's dresses, and
Your grandfather did?
My grandpa did. And we hopped over the fence and he went out, and he had a club under his dress. And he was going to knock the holy hell out of that bull and teach it not to mess with Grandma again. And
did it work?
It worked. That bull started to come at him, pawing the ground, and he was ready with his club. And then the bull came at him, and he says, "I took that club. I tried to take that club." He says, "It was caught in my dress." He says, "I was still hanging on to that club when I went over the fence." And he says, "I took those clothes off and I went in," and he says, "I almost killed that bull." But Grandpa still wouldn't go back into that field again. But he learned a hard life. And one day he gave my mother $1 to go into Columbus to buy the thread and the cloth to make her a dress. And she was really happy that he'd given her that much. And she was able to buy all the material and the thread for 50 cents. And she went back home and showed Grandpa what she had bought and gave him back 50 cents. And he got upset because she spent so much money, even though he had given her permission to spend $1. Back in those days, a lot of dresses were made out of flour sacks from the local flour mill. You would buy grain for your cattle and for your goats or whatever you had, and then you would clean the sack up and sew it up and make a dress. And some of the colors were pretty neat, but most dresses back then were actually made out of flour sacks and feed sacks. And but she was able to sew one from her 50 cents. But Grandpa would sell his sassafras roots and ginseng roots over in Cincinnati, and make one trip a year over to Cincinnati. And that was one of the few things they could really sell. They sold some eggs and some milk and so on. And back in those days, I really didn't know where milk came from. And we was having breakfast when we spent a weekend with Grandpa and Grandma, and we ran out of milk. And Grandpa says, "Bill," says, "why don't you go down to Uncle Raymond's and get some milk?" And he gave me a bucket. So I took the bucket down to Uncle Raymond's. He lived the equivalent of about a block away. And I said, "Grandpa sent me down for some milk," and I says, "Here's a bucket." I says, "Do you have any milk?" And we was accustomed to reaching in the refrigerator and pulling out a bottle. He says, "Yeah, I'll go get some." He says, "Come with me." And I says, "Where are we going?" He says, "Outside." And I thought, this is kind of strange to go outside, get a bucket of milk, you know. And so he walked up to a cow and he started to reach down underneath, and I thought, what's going on here? And pretty soon he was squirting, you know, he's squirting milk out of this cow, and I thought, this is weird. And I says, "What's that?" And he says, "That's milk." I says, "Really?" I said, we get it out of bottles. So we got some milk and took it back, and I didn't like it. It didn't come out of a bottle, and it didn't taste good. It was still warm, of course. But I never did like milk out of a cow. I just liked it out of a bottle. but I'll never forget that day. It was really weird that milk came from a cow.
Did he let you milk it?
I tried, but I could never catch on to it. And later on, Mom and Dad bought a farm, and then they had a cow, and Mom milked it. But instead of, I should have jerked instead of squeezed, or squeezed instead of jerk. I just didn't have the rhythm required. I might be able to do it today, but you kind of strip it, and then you squeeze, and as you get down to the end, I think, then you give it a real tight squeeze.
You give it a good squeeze.
But I was never good at that. And not that it made me mad, because I didn't especially like to mess around with a cow anyhow, because they could sometimes be a little bit aggressive. But I was never a successful milker. It just never worked for me. So Mom handled it when we had a cow. But I think she was kind of living her second childhood on the farm, and Grandpa was pretty rough on her. One of the things I do remember in childhood was at one time, if you wasn't very wealthy at least, you had funerals at home, in your house. And we was taking care of Grandma, and Grandma died. And doctor came out, pronounced her dead, and then the next thing I knew, there was a casket in our living room. Grandma was in it.
How soon after she died was she in the casket?
Same day. They didn't, he had a pretty quick funeral. They didn't doctor him up and drain the blood and do all that stuff that they do today. It cost too much money. And Grandma was in the living room overnight, and then the funeral was the next day, and I didn't like seeing Grandma dead. And I really didn't like to see her in my house. You know, it was not a good thing. I had some nightmares over that one. I'm glad they do it differently today, at least in our country, I'm sure. You know, but my work experience, I worked at Cummins Engine Company for 27 years, almost 28 years. And I was able, in the latter 12, 14 years, to travel all over the United States, Canada, Europe, Africa, and a little bit in the Mideast. And I was in Chile one year, and working at the Chuquicamata copper mine, the largest copper mine in the world. At that time, I think probably still is. And we had to go to a guy from the distributor at Cummins distributor in Chile asked me to go to Antofagasta, which is on the ocean in northern Chile. And I said, what kind of problem do we have there? And he said, well, they have a generator set, and once every year the government measures the amount of electricity that a company can generate, and then they base their annual costs to the business of using electricity on the amount that they can generate themselves. So they get a prorated amount on their invoices. And he said their generator won't generate any electricity. He says it doesn't run full RPM. And so we took a bus ride across the desert at night, and I've never seen so many stars in my life. There was no pollution there, the air was clean, and the air was dry, and there are billions of stars up there compared to what we can see in the Midwest. There's just no comparison, and I couldn't go to sleep on it because I was just marveling at the most beautiful sky I'd ever seen. And we got over to Antofagasta.